I think we all know what an outlaw is. We all know that there's this kind of rebel character who doesn't obey the law and does things his own way. And the word outlaw comes into our minds when we talk about such a character. So, who exactly is an outlaw? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself that? In today's video, we will focus on the historical legal definition of outlaw. For this definition, we will refer to the Scottish Encyclopedia, which defines an outlaw as one who is declared outside the protection of the law. Well, we see that in order to be called an outlaw, one must be sentenced to be outside the protection of the law. So, how would someone receive such a sentence? According to the same source, an outlaw is one who has been found guilty in a court of competent jurisdiction of felony or other high misdemeanor involving violence to the person, and has been sentenced by the court to be punished by fine or imprisonment, or both, and is made default. But there are other ways to become an outlaw. You can be declared an outlaw if you flee from justice, if you avoid prison or court appearance, and even if you fail to testify against your peers. When you hear the word outlaw, you probably picture a rebellious bank robber, a cowboy on the run, or a folk hero like Robin Hood. But the original meaning of the word isn't romantic at all. It's far darker and more brutal than most people realize. In historical legal systems, an outlaw wasn't just a criminal. They were officially sentenced to be outside of the protection of the law. This was one of the harshest judgments a court could issue, a penalty that meant the condemned lost all legal rights, had no claim to a trial, and could be persecuted or even killed by anyone with absolute impunity. This is the terrifying, forgotten reality of outlaw. It is easy to get caught up in the swashbuckling image of legendary outlaws like Billy the Kid or Jesse James. However, being an outlaw in reality was anything but exciting. After being declared an outlaw, the only thing to do was to keep running. Authorities wouldn't hesitate to use deadly force to recapture you. And now you're a wanted criminal, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing where danger lurks around the corner. It was a lonely, desperate existence, very different from the romanticized version. In fact, many of these famous outlaws eventually met their demise in shootouts with law enforcement, emphasizing the perilous nature of this lifestyle. Being declared an outlaw meant that you were literally no longer under the protection of the law. Any arrest meant that you were charged with a serious crime, usually involving violence. Once found guilty, the sentence was a brutal one, often involving lengthy periods of imprisonment. But what if you avoided the prison sentence somehow? Even then, the consequences were dire. Because according to the historical legal definition, the person who didn't serve their time or pay the fine was considered an outlaw. That means that they weren't just a fugitive, but someone who was outside the law entirely. So if you were an outlaw, you were nobody. You had no legal standing. You couldn't enter into contracts, buy or sell property, or even testify in court. Your rights had been stripped away. Being declared an outlaw wasn't just about fleeing justice. It was a formal declaration by the legal system that you no longer existed as a protected citizen. The authorities withdrew all legal protection from the individual. This meant they had no standing in court, no right to their property, and no claim to safety. They were completely exposed. In medieval and early modern Europe, the stigma of being an outlaw was compounded by religious beliefs. The Christian doctrine of the no soul or no salvation applied to those who committed grave sins, such as murder or grave sacrilege. This was a punishment reserved for the worst of sinners. By declaring them no soul, the church officials meant that the individual was considered so corrupt that they no longer had a soul or hope for salvation. The implication was a loss of humanity. Such a judgment was often handed down to those who broke important religious laws or engaged in heinous acts. This social and religious stigma further isolated outlaws, turning them into social pariahs and making capture and punishment even more likely. In essence, the declaration of no soul added a spiritual dimension to the earthly punishment of outlaw. It transformed the legal penalty into a fate worse than death, cutting the individual off from the possibility of redemption. So what would happen if you were declared an outlaw? What kind of punishment would you face? What would happen to you? One of the most well-known aspects of outlawry is the symbol that accompanied it, the death of rights. To be declared an outlaw was to suffer a form of civil or social death. In pre-modern societies, outlawing was the most extreme punishment, often considered a substitute for a death sentence. The concept of outlawry wasn't just about physical banishment. It was a comprehensive removal of the individual from the legal and social order. This meant that an outlaw wasn't just a person who had broken the law and fled, but someone who was officially dead within the legal and societal structure. There was no middle ground. Either you were completely part of the community and protected by the law, or you were nothing, considered non-existent within the framework of the legal system. This stark binary left no room for negotiation. Once declared an outlaw, An individual's status could only change when they were either killed or captured and brought back into the fold. In medieval and early modern England, this was formalized through the infamous Letty's B of Wolf's Head decree. This gruesome pronouncement, made in the name of the king, was essentially a death warrant. The outlaw was likened to a wolf, an animal that lived outside the protection of human society and could be killed without consequence. The use of such graphic imagery emphasized the severity of the outlaw's status. It was a clear indication that the individual had been cast out of civilization and was now seen as a threat to be eliminated. During the Middle Ages, the declaration of Let us be a wolf's head was a significant event, often accompanied by public ceremonies where the outlaw's image was displayed and a price was put on their head. The image of the wolf's head became synonymous with the idea of outlaw, representing the utter removal of an individual from the protection of society and the tacit permission to kill the outlaw without facing any legal repercussions. Today, we might think of Robin Hood as a folk hero who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. But during his time, he would have been considered an outlaw, living outside the protection of the law. The story of Robin Hood is a compelling example of how the concept of outlawry has evolved in our collective consciousness. The traditional narrative portrays Robin Hood as a noble outlaw, fighting against injustice and stealing from those who exploit the poor. This romanticized version of events, however, doesn't align with the actual legal status of Robin Hood if he were alive during medieval England. According to the laws of the time, Robin Hood and his band of merry men would be considered dangerous criminals. Their activities, regardless of the motivation, were viewed as outright robbery and an affront to the established legal and social order. Each time Robin Hood and his men stole from someone, whether a nobleman or a peasant, they were perpetrating a crime punishable by the law. Even though we may sympathize with Robin Hood's cause today, it's essential to recognize that in the context of his own time, he and his companions would have been regarded as outlaws. His legendary status as a folk hero developed much later, largely due to literary embellishments and a desire to champion the oppressed. So while we may celebrate Robin Hood's defiance of authority in his fight for justice today, it's crucial to acknowledge that in reality, he would have been nothing more than a common criminal. Well, folks, this was another video about everything you didn't learn anywhere else. Thank you for watching and subscribing. Until next time.